Welcome to I Am Goddess Collective podcast, a sacred space for empowerment through modern magic, spiritual activism, and reclaiming your power. I am your host, Nixie Marie, feng shui practitioner, earth activist, and mystic, here to support and inspire your journey in becoming the change you wish to see in this world. That change starts within. Join myself and fellow thought leaders, metaphysical experts, and luminaries each week as we explore practical and magical ways to living in your highest alignment. Your journey as an empowered goddess begins here. Let's dive in. Hello, sisters. Welcome back to I Am Goddess Collective. Happy to be here as always. I hope you're enjoying this October month. I know I am very much in the cozy sweater vibe, even though it's not super cold yet here in LA, but it's definitely, you can feel the shift happening. And as I've mentioned, I think a few times before, but this is actually my favorite month of the year, mostly because I always feel so invited to really go within and practice my craft in a very solitary way. I love to just sit in front of my altar and connect with the outer realms because the veils become very thin. And I know some of you guys might be curious about what it means for the veils to become so thin right now. And ultimately, this is a opportunity for us to be bridged between this outer world and the inner world, or the physical world and the non-physical. So good opportunity to connect with ancestors, with your spirit guide team, with maybe some elementals, or anyone else that's out there that you want to connect with. I would say it is time now, especially on Samhain, as we approach closer to the witch's new year. We will start to really begin to feel maybe a presence around us. And I think the biggest tool that I want to share with this is just being able to trust it and to know that this feeling, or this presence, or this whisper or softness, whatever that might be trying to connect with you, is something that wants to be of service to you. So trust that and see what you can find and create this month, because it is a very special month and a really beautiful time to decorate your home with pumpkins and just celebrating that harvest season and reaping the benefits of this abundant season and cycle of this wheel of the year. So this week on the podcast, we have got a very lovely witch on the show, and I've definitely curated this month to be showcasing some of my favorite witches and practicing that are actually active in practicing the craft. And so we've got Pam Grossman on the show today. She is an author of Waking the Witch, Women, Magic, and Power. She is also a podcast host of a podcast called The Witch Wave. So we're going to dive into really like this awesome conversation about the archetype of the witch, celebrating the witch, and paganism coming out of the broom closet. So it's a really good episode. I'm excited for you guys to deep dive into that. But before we do, just remember that we've got our membership online coven, the Goddess Life membership, going this month. And in this month's actual theme, we're going into a conversation about getting back into balance in your life. Libra season brings this amazing opportunity for us to bring everything back into balance after maybe some maybe too much fun over summer. I don't know. I hope you guys had a really fun summer, but this month is an invitation for us to just go back to that balance and really be in a place of uplifting yourself, coming to a really special divine, time to look at every single area of your life that is not in balance, and to really do some deep diving and ask yourself, like, how can you bring all of those things back to balance? How can you bring your relationships into balance, your love life, your family, your, all the things that financially and business, career? How can all these things be in balance so that you are really living abundant in all these different areas? So within that, we also have a workshop on shadow work, working with your ancestors. We're doing a Samhain ritual at the very end of the month. We're also going to be talking a lot about the word abracadabra and how we cast our spells out into the world every day with how we speak. So I'm very excited for that workshop. And you guys can go on over to iamgoddesscollective.com/member to join in on the fun this month. So without further ado, I do want to read a review before we get really into this amazing podcast episode for the day. So recent review we have is from JROB217, and he says, "Thanks. I love your courage and resolve to explore your sexuality," or she says thanks. I don't know if this is a woman or a man. It sort of sounds like J. Rob, so it could be either, but welcome to the show. Thank you for listening. I love your courage and resolve to explore your sexuality and share it with all that hide behind a handle or moniker. Keep inspiring what should be normalcy. Hashtag hot girl. Okay, thank you. I feel like that might be a masculine energy there. So thank you so much for listening. Thanks to all that have written a review on iTunes. Really appreciate reading these reviews. The other day I was just going through and reading, and they felt really good to remind myself of why I do this. So it really is a beautiful gift that you can participate to the show and just tell us what you think. Tell us how you've been enjoying it, and really appreciate it. So, all right, let's get into this episode with Pam Grossman. I'm very excited. Just sit back and relax and enjoy this amazing transmission. Talk to you guys soon on the other side. Hello, beautiful sisters. Welcome back to another episode of the I Am Goddess Collective podcast. I'm so honored and excited and thrilled to bring to you a fabulous guest that we have on, someone who I am a big fan of, and I'm sure you guys might have heard of her. We've got Pam Grossman on the show. Hello, love.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
We're honored to have you. So Pam is actually another host of a podcast called The Witch Wave, and she is also the author of Waking the Witch. And so she's a writer, curator, and teacher of magical practice and history. And she also is very much, I would say a lot of passion in bringing like the art and witchcraft into this beautiful alchemy. And she's got projects including Language of the Birds, Occult and Art at NYU's 80s WSE Gallery, and has been featured by such outlets as Artforum, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art in America, New York Magazine, and Teen Vogue. So such a special guest to have. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
Yeah. So I love always asking these intro questions to our guests, and one of which is, what crystals are you currently working with and why?
Ooh, well, I have to say that even though I try to expand my palette when it comes to crystals, I always have some kind of good standbys that I come back to. So for example, I have this necklace that I wear of quartz crystal points. There might be 40 or 50 of them. I mean, it's a real power necklace. And it's a necklace that I got custom made here in New York City. There used to be this beautiful bead shop in Soho, which unfortunately isn't there anymore. But they would source all these beautiful beads and gemstones from around the world. And so I commissioned, I wanted to have just this huge collar piece made out of all these quartz crystal points. And so they made that for me. Gosh, it must be well over 10 years ago now. And that's a necklace that I bring out on pretty special occasions. I actually wore it yesterday because I went through a purification ritual, which maybe we can talk about. But that's a real power gemstone for me. And I know it's such an obvious one, but I just find it to be so beautiful and clarifying. And I love it. So that's a big one for me. And then, When I was younger, I kind of stayed away from rose quartz because I thought it was so, I don't know, kind of corny and new agey. And the older I get, the more attracted I am to it. And the more I realize that love, even if it's soft and gentle, especially self-love, it can also be really fierce and radical. And so I've been embracing rose quartz a lot more too. And then I'm a February baby, so amethyst has always been a really important stone to me too.
That's beautiful. It's funny you said rose quartz because I was just walking around with my rose quartz spear in my hand. I was doing some like photo stuff yesterday and I was trying to figure out where to put it in my house. So I do love rose quartz. I recently have started working with it, like actually setting the intention, like allowing for its medicine to move through. So it's a beautiful stone.
It is a beautiful stone. And it's one that I find myself coming back to a lot as I get older because self-love has become more and more important to me. And as I'm moving through different phases of my life and aging and all of that, just being really compassionate towards myself has become a real priority for me. But it's interesting. Sometimes stones, I'll work with them for a while when I need something specific. So when I was writing the book, I was working very closely with, I hear people pronounce this two different ways. So you let me know which is correct. Lapis Lazuli or Lapis Lazuli. Which do you say?
Lazuli as well.
Lazuli. Yeah. Just that beautiful blue stone, which I was told helps with voice and speech and communication.
Yep.
And then I've been working with carnelian around confidence and, really standing in my power to be able to communicate as clearly as I am able to, because this message of my book is so much bigger than me. And I want to make sure I'm up to the task.
Oh yeah. I've actually got a carnelian stone right in front of me. So
fabulous.
I feel you, girl. We're on that flow. So your work is incredibly dedicated to the craft of the wise, and you identify publicly as a witch. So I'm really curious. I think everybody always is, how you really found yourself on this path, and if like coming out of the broom closet was even challenging for you at all, or if it was somewhat of an easy journey.
Yeah, well, my story, as I suppose most people's really happened in a lot of phases. It wasn't like one day I announced it to the world and, held a press conference about it. It really has been a step-by-step process for me. So, the kind of Cliff's Notes version is, ever since I was a child, I was obsessed with magic and mythology and fairy tales, like a lot of kids are. And I did a lot of kind of intuitive rituals in my backyard in the woods. And I read constantly about magic and witchcraft and all kinds of myths and mysteries. And then when I became a teenager, I discovered that witchcraft was something that people could actually do, and found myself kind of experimenting with spell books, and nothing super fancy, just the stuff that I would find like at my local mall bookshop, or, there were some new age stores that were a little far afield for me. I grew up in central New Jersey. So there were some like college towns that you'd have to drive to, or, more like hippy dippy towns. So on those rare occasions, I would just go nuts in the new age stores and take home all of these spell books and start experimenting. And then as I got older, that became a much more intuitive practice, largely because I didn't have the resources to source every single ingredient that these spell books listed. I didn't have all of this
like
stuff,
wolf
and I didn't
hair
have a lot
on the
of
wolf's
money.
back or something.
Exactly.
Whiskers of a jaguar. I don't know. Totally feel you.
Right. But even, if you're like a 13-year-old, even getting like, I don't know, in the 90s, just rose petals were hard to find. I mean, I didn't have a car. I didn't really have a lot of my own money. So, so things like that might even seem much more accessible now seemed pretty exotic to me back then. And so I would have to kind of freestyle and just work with whatever we had in our house and in our kitchen and in my mom's closet and my closet. And I found that those spells still really worked. And that was interesting to me. It was interesting that you didn't have to have the exact recipe, that as long as you were coming to it with your own symbolic system and your own creative energy and intention, that the spells were still effective. And then that really evolved as I became more of an artist and a writer, and my art practice and creative practice and my magical practice really feed each other and often overlap. And that all continued on until I was in college. And I mean, you know, there are many more details to the story, but I'll just kind of catch us up by saying, you know, for many years, I had a corporate job here in New York City. I was working for a corporation for 14 years. And on the side, I was doing all of this curating and writing and teaching classes and ritual. And so I was never pretending not to be a witch, but I also wasn't like super loud and proud about it at my day job. And people who knew my interests, certainly, you know, it was a pretty artistic day job. I worked for a photography company, but still, you know, I was pretty careful about who knew what I was and what I was interested in. And then after a while, I just kind of got exhausted from having this bifurcation in my life. And I started really using the word witch to describe myself in public much more frequently. Again, not so much at my day job, but much more so when I was doing my classes and curating art shows and writing. And it just became a word that felt important to me to claim. And someone who really inspired me to be more public about it is a teacher that I studied with named Robin Rose Bennett, who's a green witch and an herbalist. And I took many classes with her here in New York City and eventually became one of her apprentices. Wow. And I think that was probably a real turning point for me, for sure, too. Yeah. Just meeting others.
Right. Well, it really brings things home. It's like, oh, there's others out there like me, you know, and to be especially underneath somebody who's been on the path for a while, I think is so powerful. And clearly it was in alignment for you to really follow this and pursue this as then being a professional career. So, well, you were in corporate. So what was that transition like for you to really step into like writing your book and dedicating your path to this as a career?
Yeah, it was a big leap of faith and also happened in many steps. So by the time I left my job, I was a director. I was speaking all over the world and, you know, being interviewed as kind of a representative of this company. And I was doing very meaningful work. I was doing a lot of work in the space of using the power of images to break gender stereotypes and to promote, you know, a more inclusive vision of the world, and one that was much more diverse and, you know, as the world actually is. So it's not like I was faking it all along. Like I got a lot of meaning out of my day job. But as the demands on my time at my day job were growing, and as my responsibilities were growing, so too I guess you'll call it my side hustle was growing too. I was getting more opportunities to write and to speak and to teach and to curate in the space of magic and witches, and that just fed my soul so much more, which isn't to say that I didn't get a lot out of my day job, because I did. It wasn't quite so simple. But my if I'm just being very candid, my true passion and true joy is in the space of what I'm doing now. And so there just became this kind of breaking point in really around like 2016, which I think a lot of people probably had a breaking point around them too. But even in the year or two leading up to that, where my health was starting to suffer, I was just feeling really burnt out because I was working so hard at work, and then I was working so hard doing all my passion projects. And I eventually was like, I have to figure out, I have to make a choice. Yeah. And before then, I felt pretty integrated. I felt like, okay, I have this day job and it allows me to be a patron to myself and to invest in my other projects. Right. So, it felt really integrated. And then after a while, it just didn't anymore. I felt like I was being pulled in two directions. And so I had a lot of soul searching and conversations with my amazing husband and with my day job. And at first I just took an unpaid sabbatical. So I took 6 months off unpaid just to kind of recharge my batteries and catch my breath and really decide what I wanted to do. And it was during that time that I started working on the book, and I launched my podcast. And then when the 6 months were up and it was time for me to go back to work, I was like, there is no way I can kind of stuff myself back in that box. And as the stars aligned, I happened to get a book deal like right at the end of that time period. And I'll be very frank with everybody, that book money was significantly less than the money I was making at my corporate day job as a director, but it was enough that my husband and I could still pay our bills. And I was like, I got to go for it. So I ended up officially quitting my job and finishing the book and keeping on doing the podcast. And so it's really been 2 years since I made that decision. And, there's still a lot of ups and downs and uncertainty with it. Mm-hmm. And yet I know that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't have any doubts about that.
I just got like chills when you're, kind of explaining that story. It's inspiring, and I think the way that you did it and set yourself up for success in a way, like taking time and really figuring it out. And, instead of just taking the leap and having nothing to fall, I think is really important, because it's challenging already enough to be an entrepreneur and really pursue your heart's big, like greatest calling. But when you don't have some foundation to jump into, it's even more, it's just a lot more challenging. And there is faith with that too, I think. But I think that for listeners out there that, have that same maybe motivation or ready to, take that leap, I think that's a really beautiful way to do it, to take some time and really figure out, are you up for the challenge? Ultimately.
Absolutely. And I was really fortunate that I was able to negotiate a sabbatical. I know a lot of people aren't in that position. And if they had said no, I don't know what I would have done. I don't know if I would have quit or what. But I feel really lucky because it gave me a testing ground to be like, what does it feel like to not make any money, for 6 months? And I saved up for it. And, we strategized to figure out how to make it work. But, I'm very lucky that I knew that I had a job to go back to. And I know not everybody's in that position. So I give my old day job lots and lots of credit for that. And I also don't want to misrepresent, because I think it's important that we talk about money honestly.
Absolutely.
My husband has a job. My husband has health insurance. Now he works in the nonprofit sector. We are not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we're fine, and not everybody has a partner they can rely on, or, and so on. So I'm very, very blessed in that respect. And I'm blessed that I have a partner who is also an artist and who's still doing the day job and the art on the side gig. But that allows me to ramp this up. And, my hope is one day he can quit his day job, but we'll get there.
Yeah. What just came to mind is I really believe in when you put your heart out there and you follow your passion and you really take risks. And, all these things generally will fall into place, just like, you're saying, but you have a partner and you have these blessings in your life. And I really believe that it's because you've committed to something so much bigger than yourself,
I think so too, but I think people do have to know that there is sacrifice that comes with it, and there's real reckoning that happens too. I mean, for me, I'm someone who sometimes battles anxiety anyway, and this definitely has flared up my anxiety in moments, and I have to work really hard to, make sure I'm going to therapy and make sure I'm, taking care of myself in a lot of other ways, because the uncertainty of freelance life for somebody like me who, is very proactive and likes a schedule and a plan, having to learn about surrender and trust and faith has been something that's, I think, very necessary for me, but also really scary at times. And, writing a book is really, really difficult. At least it was for me. And there were all kinds of ups and downs along that road too. So there are going to be challenges, but even when I was going through some of the worst of that, I didn't feel like, oh, this means I made the wrong decision. It just felt like, okay, this is just hard in a different way now, but in a way that's so much more fulfilling.
Right. And it's not really supposed to be easy.
Exactly.
That I do know. Well, let's get into your book, because we're talking a lot about this book that you wrote and the back end of what that looks like and the process of coming into that. And your book is called Waking the Witch. And so can you kind of give us a little insight on what its content consists of?
Absolutely. So it's a nonfiction book, and its subtitle is Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power. And it's essentially an analysis of the witch from a symbolic or archetypal perspective. What is a witch? Where does this concept come from? But also, why is it so popular now? What has it meant to me in my life? And most significantly, what does it tell us about our feelings about, I'll just use the word women broadly, but about feminine power, about things that society has deemed feminine, because certainly people of all genders have been called witches or have elected to identify as witches. But it really is an archetype that for most of its history was associated with negative things and fears that we had about women and about female power. Now, certainly that's evolved. And in the last 150 years, we've seen a much more positive feminist version of what a witch is. And I imagine we'll talk about that later. But I really wanted to explore all of that and celebrate the witch as this very complicated, primarily feminine symbol.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty much all the goods. Well, it really brings up, like, what exactly do you feel identifying as a witch in today's society actually means?
One of the things that I explore in this book is that it means different things for me and different people, depending on the contexts. So certainly in my case, and in the case of many others, I mean it literally in that I am a practicing pagan. I do spells and rituals, and, magic is something I take seriously. And that is a real part of my life and a real lens through which I look at the world. But still, the word witch is also associated with rebelliousness, with being an outsider, with being a force that subverts patriarchal norms. And so even for people who maybe don't do magic, but like to call themselves witches in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, or as a political stance, or, to kind of culturally identify as a witch, or identify as a witch because they're activists, like that's all fine too. And I use that word in that context for myself too, because I am a feminist and I am somebody who wants to help subvert, cis white heteronormative patriarchy. And so, yeah, the word means a lot of different things. And this is all talking about those of us who choose to call ourselves witches, which these days in the West anyway, is usually a positive thing. But let's be honest, if someone calls you a witch in certain contexts, it can still be insulting. It can still be very dangerous. There are communities here in the US and certainly in certain countries around the world where you can still be killed for being accused of witchcraft or being a witch. So it's still a very loaded word. And I find all of that complexity really fascinating and important to dissect.
Yeah, I really believe it can be very triggering for a lot of people. And just to even, as a witch, go through the process of identifying as one, I think is really, it's quite a journey in itself, especially for those who perhaps have been brought into this lifetime with a lot of those karmic ties or, trauma or just all those past life experiences that have those triggering moments. So what would you say to someone who's kind of struggling with identifying as that, or even coming out to their friends, their peers, their loved ones?
I get this question a lot,
Sure.
especially from people who, not even talking about prior lives, but in this lifetime, they're in a community, maybe they have a certain religion that they're part of, or I should say a religious sect they're part of, because I don't believe any one religion is all bad or all good. I think all religions have some good stuff and some not so good stuff. But there's certainly some extremely conservative aspects of pretty much every religion you can imagine, where they still view witchcraft as being associated with diabolism and evil. So, what I tell people is, first of all, you do not have to use this word in public if you don't want to. You can just know it about yourself. I mean, your safety comes first, always. But, still, there are a lot of people who are like, this is who I am, and this is my practice. This is my spirituality. And it's important to me that people know this about me, and yet I'm afraid I'll be ostracized. And all I can say is, to know that witches are not evil, that there have been hundreds of years of propaganda and campaigning, literal campaigning, by various religious and political forces who have associated witches with the devil. But it's actually a relatively new association. I mean, we didn't really see that start to happen in earnest until like the end of the 15th century. That's when witch hunting manuals started to be printed due to the advent of the printing press. And that's when, I do believe there's a lot of good about Christianity still, but I will say back then, the church was really against women and against sexuality and demonized female sexuality in general. And anyone who they thought was a threat, they would call a witch. And usually it was women, not always, but usually it was. Very often it was women who had land that other people wanted, because sometimes they were widows, other times they were older women or women that didn't have children or didn't have enough children. So basically any woman who was quote unquote out of line could be accused of as being a witch or being a threat to society. And so I guess if there's any way that you can educate the people who have these fears about the history of the word and how, politicized that word has become, that's a good place to start. But I know not everybody is open to having their mind changed. And at that point, I also say, try to find the others, try to draw strength and protection from other witches that you might meet in person or online. Maybe you want to start your own coven. I know some people are like, I live in the middle of nowhere. I don't know any witchy people. You know, the internet really is your friend. There are all kinds of groups and Instagram witches you can follow and so on to at least try to build some community and draw some sustenance from that.
Yeah. Well, and you said in the beginning, your path began in the 90s, which I think it's so fascinating how, you know, when I started my journey a little over a decade ago, when I went into bookstores, there was like one in Barnes and Noble, like one little section for the esoteric, occulticism, witchcraft, like all those things related to what I was interested in. But now when you go into these bookstores, it's like an entire 4 bookshelves of new authors and new books. And I just find it so fascinating because I honestly didn't foresee that coming. It was like, felt like overnight, honestly, like one minute I was in there and the next minute now it's like everywhere. So
absolutely,
you know, I think it's wild and also brings me to this question of, you know, what your book in that category really, like what type of witch should read your book, you know, what differentiates yours from some of the other ones out there, because there's just so much content now that it's like so inspiring and also so amazing, but at the same time it's like, well, why is there so much, you know, and why is this resurgence happening?
Sure. Well, I hear a few different threads that we can go off in. So let me start with the first question, which is
it's a big question.
No, they're important questions. And to your point, you know, I'm seeing the same thing. I mean, hashtag witches of Instagram now has 3 million posts on it. As I write in the book, hashtag witch blur, that's witch BLR, entered Tumblr's top search results in the year 2017. It was number 11 and it hadn't appeared in Tumblr's top hashtags before that. So we're also seeing real evidence of this growing interest. And the other thing that's been interesting, just as a side note, is the different language that is being used around it too. So sometimes you'll find these books in the New Age section or occult section. I noticed recently that Barnes and Noble is now calling it the self-transformation section in some of their bookstores, which I actually think has a lovely ring to it.
That's kind of the way I see witchcraft, honestly.
Yeah. I see it as self-transformation, but also transformation of the world. I mean, I really think it's that big and that powerful where it can be. But anyhow, I really like that term. And I wanted to write a book that kind of wove together a lot of these different threads about what a witch is. And essentially, I wrote a book that I was hoping to find and I kept looking for it and I couldn't find it anywhere. And I was like, I guess I got to write it.
And that's when you know.
Essentially, you know, you'll find a lot of books out there about, you know, the witch in pop culture. Or you'll find books out there about the history of the witch or the history of the witch hunts. Or you'll find books about images of witches in fine art. Like all of these different kind of very focused, limited pieces of the story. But I really wanted to see if I couldn't weave together a grander narrative around, yes, but how did witches become good? Like, yes, they started out as evil and how did that happen and why? And then how is it that now, you know, we have people think it's an old religion, but Wicca is a very new religion. It only really came into popularity in like the 1950s, 1960s. And so like, how did that happen? How are there all of these, you know, books with teen witches now, like Hermione or, you know, Sabrina? Like, where did that come from? Because I always associated witches as being really cool and really empowering. And so I wanted to see if I could kind of fill in those blanks, both for myself, and there is a bit of my own personal narrative woven throughout the book, but also just for kind of the history of the world in general. Like, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from witches being hideous hags to being Hermione? And that's really kind of what the book traces. You know, it touches on pop culture, it touches on art, it touches on politics. It certainly talks about witches and the devil and witch hunts and all of that. And it tries to show this holistic picture of how witches reflect our fears and our fantasies about feminine power.
Yes, nailed it. I love that. I love that you brought in like your own alchemy and the things that you're passionate about. And I think that's really why, you know, the entrepreneur, that calling, or author or writer, it's because you get to create something that didn't exist, right?
Exactly. And I think that's often the best kind of conjuring, right? You're like, what do I want to manifest? Not only what do I need or want, but what do I think will be of service to something bigger than myself? And that's something that I'm constantly asking myself and asking spirit for, which is to help me. Yes, of course, there are things that me and my little ego want, right? But I think we're here for a much bigger purpose, which is to connect with others and to help others and to be of service to love and magic and spirit. And so that's really what I hope the book is doing as well.
So how do you mentioned earlier that you believe that witchcraft can transform the world, not only ourselves, but the earth and the planet and the world. So how do you think that can make such an impact?
Well, I think so much of how we choose to embody this earth and our actual bodies really comes back to story, and it comes back to the kind of symbols and the kind of narratives that we devote our time and attention to. And so if we have, you know, certainly this new generation of people, but there have been many generations of people who have associated witches with this more rebellious, positive, feminist, change-making energy. We started seeing this in the mid-19th century, right when women were starting to value themselves more and demand, you know, voting rights and demand, you know, equal rights. They, you know, learning from some scholars that came before them, but a lot of those early feminists started reframing the witch as this more positive figure and started relating to, you know, being an oppressed, powerful female who could actually use their power to change themselves and to change the world, and to know that they had this inherent wisdom within them. And so I think even reframing the witch as a positive symbol helps us reorient ourselves to know that we have value and worth, even though we look different or might act differently than a lot of the people who are still very much in power. So I think that's part of it. And I also think quite literally, when you are, and not every witch I know practices in this way, but a lot of witches like me consider themselves to be pagan or in line with paganism, which is essentially honoring nature and seeing nature as divine. And when you see nature as divine and you see your body as divine, you start valuing those things more, and you start then showing up for environmental activism and for autonomy over, you know, women's bodies. And you can't help but become more politically engaged at some level, because you're saying to yourself, this has value and divinity, and yet the structures in which I exist do not value them. You know, if you look at corporations, if you look at the government, if you look at a lot of the world religions that still see women and nature as secondary to men and profit.
Wow. Yep. Mic drop. Yeah. Wow. That's definitely, you nailed it on that one. I think that, the witch embodying that, really there's like an inner activist that is born, and sometimes it takes a little long to figure out, you know, where the arrow is pointing. But I really strongly believe, you know, that's where originally the feminist movement started. It's like, hey, I have a voice, I want to speak up, I have something to say, and also this isn't right, this isn't working. What we're doing is not supporting or conducive to having our species evolve anymore. You know, we're up to that point where we've got to make these changes. So how do you really like bring in your form of activism into your work that you do as a witch?
Well, I also want to clarify, which is not every person who identifies as a witch is going to be marching in the streets with a sign. And I know that. And activism doesn't necessarily have to look, you know, like the physicality of showing up somewhere and protesting. I think it will for a lot of us, and I hope it will for more and more of us. But there are some people who they'll say to me, look, I'm a practicing witch and I don't like politics. Like, there's nothing political about what I do. This is entirely spiritual. And for me, I'm like, yes, but you are choosing to practice a spirituality that is not owned by anybody. There's no one book you're following. You're not following any one leader. You're really guiding yourself, even if you're in a more formal coven, and maybe if you're doing like a traditionally Wiccan style coven. I don't consider myself Wiccan, but I will say, you know, if you do have like a high priest or a high priestess or something, you know, there still can be some hierarchy in covens. There aren't in mine, and there aren't in a lot of the covens that I know of these days, but still, you're still choosing to practice spirituality. Or maybe you're not even in a coven, you're a solitary practitioner. You're doing it on your own terms. You're doing it outside the parameters of capitalism, largely. You know, you can practice witchcraft literally anywhere. You don't have to join anything. You don't have to pay membership dues. There's no one set of laws or rules you have to follow. Like, my point is, that is political. That is radical, because you are practicing spirituality that is not directed or owned by other people. And it's certainly not directed or owned by the patriarchy, which.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really strong point to make, especially because all of those elements are incredibly important to realize that we don't have to follow something a certain way.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I can't believe that Catholicism, which has a lot of beauty to it, but they still don't have female priests. Like, that is insane to me in this day and age.
Yeah, me too.
You know, and that, you know, there's a lot of beauty and wisdom in, I'll just focus on the Bible. There's a lot of beauty and wisdom in there, and yet it still centers a male narrative. And we internalize these things, even if we don't believe them or believe in them. We are still surrounded by these stories all the time, and you can't help but internalize yourself as less than if the biggest stories there are that most people on the planet are reading or following some version of puts you as a female person or a queer person or a person of color in a secondary position to the divine, holy, you know, man. Like, you can't help but have some kind of damage that you, I think, ingest because of that. And so witchcraft offers a really powerful alternative, is my point.
Point made. I love it. Yeah, I think that's, and to your point too, I really believe that that's why we have seen that resurgence. It's why these things are happening, and everything sort of, not everything, but there is a lot coming to the mainstream. So, you know, I was going to ask you what your thoughts are and feelings are with so much of this sacred work becoming very mainstream and very much easily attainable to sort of pop culture, you know, and do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. I love pop culture, so I'm all for depictions of witches in pop culture. And I know some people are like, oh, I only want to see positive witches because the negative witches are still giving us a bad name. And I'm like, the whole archetype has complexity to it. Even the villainous, devilish witches in horror movies have something to teach us. They're teaching us about fear of female power. But I still think there's value there. And P.S., some of it's just really fun to watch. So I don't have problems with that. And I don't have problems with it becoming more popular because I think that we need more and more people to wake up and to be conscious and to be engaged in spiritual work, or to just, step into their feminist power, even if they're not using the word feminists in a conscious way. Yeah. The problem I have, though, is when things become culturally appropriated, which we do unfortunately see a lot in the witchcraft community, especially by people who are white, like I am, who just think they can borrow willy-nilly from any other kind of cultural group and call it witchcraft. And they're doing that without any context or respect or history. So, I think about people who are engaging in indigenous American practices, for example, saying that they're doing a smudge, which I've been educated by some indigenous friends of mine that's actually a really disrespectful word for white people to use. That you can say, okay, I'm burning herbs, I'm burning sacred herbs, but saying that you're doing a smudging ceremony is really disrespectful, because that is a very real sacred ceremony to indigenous people that's very specific. It's not as simple as just like waving smoke around with a feather, So that's just one example. The other thing that I have problems with are when people start charging money for spiritual services. Just, they're just calling themselves a witch or calling their product witchcraft and putting a price tag on it without being experienced, without doing the work, without putting in the time and really educating themselves. Because, it's not as simple as just saying, oh, this crystal is magic. I mean, like, why are you saying that? How do you know this? How are you? I don't know. I just, people are so hungry for spiritual guidance that it's frankly very easy to take advantage of them if you want to. And so I'm very, very cautious about which people whose spiritual services and goods I recommend. There are some tarot readers out there that I would be like, yes, go to them immediately. And there are some others I'd be like, they've been reading cards for like a year and they're acting like they're some big tarot expert and charging you $150 an hour. And so those are my two biggest concerns, which isn't to say that you can't charge for your skills. I believe that people should be charging for their skills. Witches can offer a service. Being a spiritual guide is a real thing. But I think it's important that people do it with integrity and consciousness and really put the work in before they start positioning themselves as experts.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think if we just look at the word, the craft, and realize that, that's something that any craft, let's just take anything like an art or music that you're passionate about, playing an instrument. It takes dedication, right? You don't like learn how to play the violin overnight. So I believe that it's a devotion to the craft essentially, and to really become an expert, you've really got to put in the work and put in the hours. And I agree. I mean, everything you said, I definitely resonate with. And I think it's really important to have that sense of, a little bit of not skepticism, really. I mean, some skepticism, but just more of a discernment around, not just choosing anything because that person's offering something, but really tuning in and practicing using your intuition and your gut instinct and, going from there.
Absolutely. On a related note to the cultural appropriation piece, I also feel compelled to add that if you are an Instagrammer, let's say, and you keep putting up images of witches that you really love, and they're all white ladies, like that's a problem, because witches have existed in every culture throughout history and still do. And so something I try to be really mindful of when I'm inviting guests on my podcast or curating the Occult Humanities Conference at NYU, or even the images I'm putting on my Instagram feed, it's really important to me that it's diverse, from certainly, a background perspective, but also, I want to make sure that we're including trans voices and that we're including men at times and queer voices and, witches, even though they have been associated with women, and even though my book delves into that history and with good reason, because that association has very much been there intentionally by the oppressors who made that connection in the first place. But I think it's important that we know that witches can look like anybody and be like anybody, and that we also learn from people who are different than us and center those voices and faces too.
Yeah, that's definitely a very important point, especially today. If we're really going to be true to the path that we've got to include that all inclusivity and diversity. And it's definitely something that I would say along this journey, especially podcasting, has become so much more pronunciated in the industry, and I think it's it's a good wake up call for those, especially myself. I come from Orange County. I'm definitely could easily be just out righted from some of these principles and understandings, because I wasn't raised around the concept of, being all inclusive and diversity. And that's really why I moved to LA, to get out of that and go on a soul searching journey to figure out, why there was some hierarchy and I felt uncomfortable. But it's been a journey for me, myself, to really understand cultural appropriation. And I think we're all on it together. So I think, just to add, it's important to have these conversations and really recognize who, you're following and who you're looking at, and are they really including everyone? It's very important. So I thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. And I think that's such a powerful thing for you to speak to. And I think especially any white person these days is, or at least should be, doing that work and having those tough conversations and those wake-up calls. I've certainly had it and will continue to have it over and over again in my own experience too. And not to beat ourselves up about it, because I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm 38. And I was raised in a time when it was like, we don't see color, we love everybody. And I didn't realize how damaging that is to people of color, because then it's like, oh, so you're not actually seeing my experience or empathizing with the fact that I do have a much harder time in certain contexts than people with white skin. And I don't know. I mean, that's just one example, but it's like, I wasn't raised to even see my own whiteness. And that's a really new concept, I think, for a lot of us. And, it's okay. But now that we know better, we have to do better. There's absolutely no going back, nor should there be. And there's so much more work to be done in that area.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, there's so much to unpack, and it is really uncomfortable. So that's why I do really find so much joy in podcasting, because it has helped me grow so much, and to have conversations like this that open these pathways to be able to have these uncomfortable conversations that, we can post on Instagram, we can go on Facebook, we can talk about, but in all reality, it's like this image and words, but somehow with conversations, when we're, having this dialogue, it tends to be more impactful for me to really go there and talk about it, versus just typing it out on my phone or, reading about it or whatever. And so I think that whoever's listening out there right now, is feeling this, I invite you to check in with that, and realize that we're all here to have these uncomfortable conversations together. And it's not something that is a solo journey. It can be, to do the inner workings of that. But, I think you've definitely brought that sense of inspiration for all of us here. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And everybody can do it. I mean, so many of us are content creators now, even in our tiny little corner of the internet. So what pictures are you putting up? If you are a jewelry company, like, what models are you using to model your witchy rings? Like, I've seen, without calling anybody out by name, I've seen certain jewelry brands that specialize in witchy jewelry who always used to use just like white, gothy, beautiful ladies as their models, who now actively use people of color to model their jewelry. And it seems like kind of a trivial thing, but it's such a powerful message to be like, this is what a witch looks like. A witch looks like everybody. It's really important.
Yeah. I mean, it just includes everyone, and we've got to definitely be that way going forward. So is a lot of that's in your book as well?
Yes, especially in the last chapter, I address these things specifically because a lot of the book is about the history of how we got to the evil witch archetype and then the positive witch archetype. But the last chapter, really the last two chapters, are about like, where are we at now? So I talk about capitalism, and I talk about diversity, and I talk about, also just this gatekeeping thing that we see sometimes between like, I'm a real witch and everybody else is just pretending to be a witch. They're posers. Like, funnily enough, even though I want my witch experts or my witch entrepreneurs to be as authentic as possible and experienced as possible, when it comes to practice, I think it's open for everybody. And even if you're a newbie baby witch, if you feel called to call yourself a witch, freaking do it. Like, I don't have a lot of patience for gatekeeping around like who's a real witch or not, unless there's money involved, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think people get to define their own identities and their own spiritual practices and, use whatever words they feel compelled to. And we all had to start somewhere, and we all got turned on to this through something. And often it wasn't like some wise old crone. It could be like, oh, you saw a Led Zeppelin album that you thought was really cool and witchy, and or like a Beyonce video. And then, oh my goodness, that led you on this whole path to witchcraft. That's great. Like, we all have to start somewhere.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you for bringing all of that wisdom in. And I appreciate your authenticity. I really do.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're coming towards the end of our show here. Unfortunately, first of all, I love your voice. I feel like your voice is when I was tuning into your podcast at one point, it's got such a beautiful, like, storytelling rhythm, and it's intoxicating in itself. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge you for that, because I think that there's so much storytelling that consists inside of this container of, exploring magic, exploring ritual, exploring witchcraft, and you really bring that home. So thank you for being so much in your integrity with all of that.
What a lovely thing to say. Thank you.
Yeah. So I love to always end the show with a couple more questions here. So first of all, where can everyone find you and get insight and purchase this book? I'm definitely going to go get this book. You can get it on Amazon or on your website?
All the places. So the easiest place to find everything that I'm up to is my website, which is just my name, pamgrossman.com. That'll lead you to my podcast, The Witch Wave. That'll lead you to my Instagram. My handles on social media are Phantasmaphile, and that's spelled with PHs. And they're very old handles from a blog that I actually still run called Phantasmaphile, which is how how a lot of this started. It's a place where I celebrate art and magic and where they overlap. So yeah, I'm Phantasmaphile on Instagram and Twitter, or WitchWavePod on Instagram and Twitter, but definitely PamGrossman.com is the easiest to remember.
Awesome.
Oh, and where to get my book? My goodness, it really is everywhere. I'm really blessed. It's everywhere you can imagine in the US. Certainly you can get it online. I always love when people source it from their indie bookstores. If they don't have it, please ask them to carry it and order it through them, because they're my favorite places. Indie shops are just, they have my heart. So if you can do that, that's great. If online is better for you, I'd rather you read it than don't. And of course, it's in a lot of libraries. It's available in the US now. It's available in the UK now. It's coming to German language regions and Spanish language regions down the road. Hopefully other languages to come. So watch this space.
Awesome. So cool. I also love that you love indie stores. That's where I originally found a lot of the books that I learned from, was in like those indie metaphysical little shops. So that's super awesome. All right.
Definitely.
So my last and final question for you. How do you invoke your inner goddess?
Oh, I love that. Well, I invoke my inner goddess often by connecting to other goddesses. There are a few goddesses that I've loved since I was a kid. One in particular is Artemis, the goddess of the moon and wildness and independence. I've just always loved her. And so I have a statue of her on my altar. I wear a lot of lunar jewelry, or jewelry with antlers or arrows, just little ways that I honor her and hold a piece of her with me all the time. And whenever I am feeling in doubt, I often see her symbols show up for me, which is how I know I'm on the right track. So I think that's a really good place to start. You know, if there's a goddess whose story or symbolism really resonates with you, learn more about her and see how you can embody her in your own life.
I love that. I love Artemis too. Actually, I'm a Sagittarius. So
nice.
She's one of my, actually, I think she's my, there's a book that I have called The 12 Faces of the Goddess. And I think she's my astrological zodiac goddess. That's like, she goes through all the ruling goddesses of each zodiac. I think Artemis is mine.
I love that. How wonderful. Yeah, I think she's great for anybody who wants to really link up with that feeling of self-ownership and self-possession, which I think is our birthright. Well, Pamela, it's been, I'm going to, Pam, however you like to be called. Oh, my mom would be thrilled that you were using the name she gave me, Pamela. Sure. I don't use it in my public life, but she would be thrilled. So no worries.
Your name came over my recording as Pamela, and then I saw that and it was just right into my brain. But Pam, it's been such an honor to have you on the show and really dive into your brain and perspectives on the craft, and I can't wait to check out your book. I'm very excited, and just congratulations on all your work and being able to really step into this path and take full ownership for who you are. It's very inspiring.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for these beautiful questions, and thank you for making a space for this kind of conversation. It's so valuable, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you. Well, sisters, it's been such a journey as always. Please go check out her podcast as well, called The Witch Wave. I know you guys are going to love it, especially if you like this podcast, because it's very much all in alignment and will dive you deeper into yourself as a witch practicing the craft. So I love you all so much. I hear you. I see you. Until next time, bye for now.